At 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Coronado, California, a SEAL trainee stopped breathing during Hell Week surf torture. They pulled him from the Pacific thinking it was hypothermia, but when the senior instructor saw the foam around his mouth, he locked down the entire base and ordered every trainee into immediate quarantine. What they found in his bloodstream would turn a training death into the biggest counterintelligence breach in Naval Special Warfare history. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and tell us which country and city you're watching from. The night had started like every other Hell Week evolution at Naval Special Warfare Center, the wind cutting across the beach at 15 knots, carrying salt spray and the voices of instructors who had been doing this long enough to know exactly how much pressure a man could take before he broke. The ocean temperature was 49 degrees, cold enough to shut down core functions in under 2 hours, cold enough to make grown men cry and beg for mercy they would never receive. Candidate Marcus Hale, 24 years old, former Division II wrestler from a small town in Ohio, had been in the surf for 92 minutes alongside 63 other men whose faces he could barely see in the darkness, their bodies locked arm in arm in a human chain that stretched 40 feet parallel to the shore while waves hammered them from behind, and instructors paced the sand with megaphones and chemical light sticks, shouting reminders that pain was temporary, that quitting was permanent, that the only way out was through. Senior Chief Instructor Dan Voller stood 30 yards up the beach, watching the evolution with the practiced eye of someone who had been running Hell Week for 11 years, who knew the difference between a man testing his limits and a man about to cross the line from physical stress into medical emergency. Voller had been a SEAL for 19 years, had run operations in places where the enemy didn't wear uniforms, and the rules of engagement were written in blood and filed in folders no one would ever read. He had trained hundreds of candidates, watched thousands quit, certified dozens who went on to earn the trident and prove they belonged in the deadliest military unit on the planet. He had seen men hallucinate from sleep deprivation, vomit from exhaustion, collapse from hypothermia, and in every case he had known exactly what he was looking at, exactly when to pull them from training, exactly how to walk the line between pushing hard enough to find warriors and pushing so hard you killed someone. Which is why at 2:39 a.m., when Hale broke from the chain and stumbled toward shore with movements that didn't look like exhaustion or panic but something else entirely, Voller was already moving before the man hit the sand. Hale fell face first into 18 inches of foam and salt water, arms splayed, no attempt to catch himself, no reflexive movement to protect his face from impact. Voller was in the surf in 4 seconds, hauling the trainee onto dry sand, rolling him onto his back, checking airway breathing circulation with muscle memory built from 2 decades of training and deployment. No pulse. Skin cold, but that was expected after 90 minutes in near freezing water. Pupils blown and fixed, which wasn't expected at all. And foam. Thick pink-tinged foam bubbling from Hale's nose and mouth in quantities that made Voller's gut tighten with instinct that preceded conscious thought. He leaned close, studying the pattern, the color, the consistency, and in that moment he knew this wasn't drowning, wasn't hypothermia, wasn't anything the medical team had protocols to handle. Voller stood, pulled his radio, and made 3 calls in rapid succession. First to the medical team staged 50 yards up the beach, second to the base operations center, third to the commanding officer's direct line. He used phrases that would mean nothing to the trainees still locked in the surf, but everything to the people who needed to know. Code Victor. Possible contamination event. Immediate lockdown protocols. By the time the medical team reached Hale at 2:44 a.m., Voller had already pulled every trainee from the water, ordered them into formation on the beach, instructed assistant instructors to separate them into groups of 8 with guards maintaining line of sight on every man. By 2:51 a.m., base security had sealed every gate, activated emergency response procedures last used during a terrorist threat assessment in 2019, established vehicle checkpoints with armed guards who had orders to detain anyone attempting to leave. By 3:04 a.m., Captain Raymond Deckard, commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Center, was standing in the medical building watching Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss, the senior emergency physician on duty, perform an examination that should have been routine and clearly wasn't. Voss had been a Navy doctor for 12 years, had served deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan, had treated everything from gunshot wounds to chemical exposure, and she recognized the signs before the tox screen confirmed what her instinct was already screaming. At 3:17 a.m. she turned to Deckard and spoke 4 words that would change the trajectory of his command. This was not accidental. The foam in Hale's lungs contained trace amounts of seawater, yes, but also cellular breakdown consistent with rapid onset paralysis, neurological damage indicating exposure to a toxin that shut down respiratory function while leaving the victim fully conscious, aware, experiencing every moment of suffocation with crystal clarity. Voss pulled a portable toxicology analyzer from the emergency equipment locker, extracted blood samples, initiated a screening sequence that would take 40 minutes to complete, and while they waited, she explained to Deckard exactly what they were dealing with. Tetrodotoxin, a paralytic neurotoxin 1,000 times more lethal than cyanide, found naturally in certain species of pufferfish, used historically as an assassination tool in Japan, and more recently as an experimental weapon by intelligence agencies who understood that the right death at the right time could look like anything from heart attack to drowning to training accident. Military-grade synthesis required laboratory equipment, advanced chemistry knowledge, and access to controlled substances that didn't exist outside of classified research facilities or black market networks, sophisticated enough to avoid detection by every major intelligence service on the planet. Someone had obtained this toxin, brought it onto a secure military installation, and administered it to a SEAL candidate during the most brutal week of the most selective military training program in the world. By 4:12 a.m., Deckard had briefed the Admiral commanding Naval Special Warfare Command, who had in turn notified the Office of Naval Intelligence, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and 3 other agencies whose names didn't appear on organizational charts. By 4:38 a.m., Special Agent Marcus Trent arrived at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in an unmarked vehicle, carrying credentials that gave him authority over every aspect of the investigation and a background that made him the right choice for a case that had national security implications written across every detail. Trent was 41 years old, former Marine Corps infantry officer with combat deployments in Fallujah and Helmand Province, recruited by NCIS specifically because he understood military culture, knew how operators thought, could tell the difference between warriors who would die for their brothers and infiltrators who would smile while planning their deaths. He walked into the medical building at 4:52 a.m., spent 11 minutes reviewing Voss's findings, asked 6 questions that revealed he understood both the medical and operational implications, then established his command center in a conference room that would become the nerve center for an investigation spanning 3 federal agencies and 14 time zones. By 5:30 a.m., Trent had conducted preliminary interviews with the 4 instructors who had been present during the surf evolution, confirmed timeline accuracy, established a perimeter around the training area, ordered forensic teams to sweep the beach and barracks for evidence of toxin administration. By 6:08 a.m., the forensic team found what they were looking for: a modified insulin auto-injector pen, spring-loaded mechanism still functional, trace residue testing positive for the same compound that killed Hale, discovered in a medical waste container inside the barracks used by Class 348. The pen was clean, no fingerprints, no DNA, wiped down with antiseptic solution that destroyed biological evidence, but couldn't eliminate the chemical signature of the toxin itself. Someone had injected Hale, disposed of the weapon in plain sight, and walked away confident that the death would be ruled accidental, that the body would be cremated before anyone thought to run advanced toxicology screening, that the investigation would close with condolences to the family and lessons learned briefings for the training staff. They had been wrong. By 7:15 a.m., NCIS had established a suspect pool consisting of the 63 remaining trainees from Class 348, 12 instructor staff members, 6 medical personnel assigned to Hell Week support, and 4 civilian contractors who had access to the training compound. Every person was photographed, fingerprinted, DNA swabbed, placed under guard in separate holding rooms with monitoring equipment recording every word, every movement, every micro-expression that might reveal guilt or knowledge or connection to whatever hostile intelligence service had decided Marcus Hale needed to die. Trent ran the interviews himself, cycling through suspects in 90-minute blocks, probing backgrounds, testing stories, watching for inconsistencies that would crack the facade every trained operative learned to maintain. Most of the trainees were exactly what they appeared to be: exhausted, traumatized, angry that someone had turned Hell Week into a crime scene, desperate to resume training and prove they belonged. But one stood out for reasons Trent couldn't initially articulate, signals his subconscious was processing faster than his conscious mind could categorize. Candidate Alexei Petrov, 26 years old, naturalized U.S. citizen, former Army Ranger with 3 deployments and a recommendation letter from a 2-star general who commanded Special Operations Command Central. Petrov's service record was impeccable: Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan, expert marksman qualification, language proficiency in Russian and Ukrainian, security clearance investigation completed 18 months prior with 0 flags or anomalies. His Hell Week performance had been exceptional, consistently in the top quartile of physical assessments, demonstrating leadership during team exercises, earning respect from instructors who didn't give respect easily. But during the interview at 8:47 a.m., Petrov displayed a level of emotional control that exceeded what training could produce, answering questions with precision that suggested rehearsal rather than recall, maintaining eye contact that was statistically perfect rather than naturally varied, holding his hands in a position that minimized stress indicators while maximizing the appearance of honesty. Trent made a note, flagged Petrov for secondary questioning, and continued through the suspect list while his gut told him he had already found his target. By 9:30 a.m., the FBI's counterintelligence division had pulled Petrov's complete file, running parallel investigation that extended beyond official record into financial records, travel history, family background, digital footprint across social media, and communication platforms. The results came back at 10:16 a.m. and confirmed every instinct Trent had been following. Petrov's bank accounts showed irregular deposits over 27 months, small amounts, always under reporting thresholds, sourced from wire transfers that originated in Cyprus, Liechtenstein, and Montenegro, countries known for banking systems that catered to intelligence services needing deniable funding mechanisms. His immigration records contained discrepancies that should have been caught during initial screening: arrival date that didn't match passport stamps, family history that conflicted with public records in Ukraine, employment timeline during adolescence that included gaps where no documentation existed, and his phone, seized during the base lockdown and cracked by NCIS cyber forensics, contained encrypted applications that had been wiped at 3:02 a.m., 15 minutes after Hale's body was pulled from the surf, 23 minutes before base lockdown made communication impossible. The wipe had been thorough but not perfect. Forensic recovery pulled fragments of deleted messages, coordinates, code phrases that meant nothing without context, but everything with the right translation key. By 11:04 a.m., NSA cryptanalysts had broken the encryption and confirmed what Trent had already concluded. Petrov was Russian military intelligence, GRU Spetsnaz with deep cover training, embedded in the United States at age 14, under a false identity constructed with resources only a nation-state could provide. His mission was long-term penetration of U.S. Special Operations, gathering intelligence on selection criteria, training methodologies, operational security protocols, and when opportunities presented themselves, eliminating candidates who posed specific threats to Russian strategic interests. Marcus Hale had been flagged by Russian intelligence 73 days prior when his college transcripts showed dual degrees in cybersecurity and Mandarin Chinese, language combinations that Naval Special Warfare was actively recruiting for operations against Chinese cyber warfare networks operating in the major maritime region in the Western Pacific. Hale represented a future threat that Russian intelligence had decided to eliminate before he could become operational, before he could deploy to regions where American and Russian interests were measured in drone strikes and submarine patrols and signals intelligence that could shift the balance of power across the Pacific. Petrov had received orders through encrypted burst transmission on a Tuesday morning, had acquired the neurotoxin from a contact operating through a pharmacy network in San Diego, had modified the insulin pen in his barracks room using tools that looked like personal grooming equipment, and had injected Hale during a moment of controlled chaos at 2:08 a.m., when 64 men were moving through darkness, and no one was watching closely enough to notice one trainee touching another's shoulder for 3 seconds before moving away. The injection had been timed perfectly, dosed precisely, calculated to take full effect during the surf evolution when cold water and physical exhaustion would mask the symptoms until respiratory failure looked like drowning. Petrov had planned it, executed it, disposed of the evidence, and resumed training with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment since adolescence, who believed his cover was impenetrable, who thought American security services were too bureaucratic and politically constrained to catch him before he completed his mission, and moved on to the next target. He had been wrong. Trent brought Petrov into interrogation room 3 at 11:52 a.m., accompanied by a senior counterintelligence officer from ONI and a Russian linguist who could catch micro-expressions in someone's native language that didn't translate to English. They didn't mention Hale. They asked about Petrov's childhood, his family, his decision to immigrate, his motivation for joining the armed forces. Petrov answered with the cover story he had maintained for 12 years, voice steady, details consistent, performance flawless, until Trent asked a question in Russian, grammatically perfect but idiomatically wrong, a trap designed to test whether Petrov would correct him the way a native speaker would. Petrov didn't. He paused for 1.4 seconds, recalculated his response, answered in English with a deflection that would have worked on someone who didn't know exactly what to look for. Trent leaned forward and asked the question that ended the performance. "What's your real name?" Petrov didn't answer immediately. He looked at Trent, then at the ONI officer, then at the camera recording every word, and in that moment he made the calculation every intelligence operative dreads. Whether maintaining cover was still possible, or whether exposure meant the mission had shifted to damage control. He chose silence, which was answer enough. By 12:47 p.m., federal marshals had Petrov in custody, transported under armed escort to a classified detention facility where enhanced interrogation protocols were authorized under provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act that most members of Congress didn't know existed. By 2:15 p.m., FBI agents had arrested Pavel and Svetlana Kozlov, the couple who had raised Petrov under the fiction that they were Ukrainian refugees, in their home outside Cleveland, Ohio, finding in their basement a sophisticated communications setup, false identity documents for 3 additional operatives, and evidence of a network that had been operating on American soil for 34 years. By 4:30 p.m., the investigation had expanded to include Army Ranger School at Fort Benning and Air Force pararescue training in New Mexico, where 2 additional foreign nationals with similar background anomalies were pulled from training and placed under surveillance pending evidence collection. By 6:12 p.m., NCIS had briefed the Secretary of Defense, who ordered a complete security review of every special operations training pipeline, every candidate with foreign birth or naturalization history, every instructor with access to sensitive information about selection criteria and operational deployment. The investigation would eventually identify 7 Russian intelligence operatives embedded in various stages of U.S. military training, 3 Chinese nationals operating under false credentials in technical schools, and a network of contractors who had been providing targeting information to hostile services for compensation that ranged from cash payments to blackmail material. The operation to remove them took 6 months, involved 11 federal agencies, and resulted in prison sentences totaling 473 years across multiple defendants. But none of that happened fast enough to save Marcus Hale. Voller stood on the beach at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado at 9:37 p.m. that evening, 31 hours after pulling Hale from the surf, watching waves roll in under a sky so clear you could see stars from horizon to horizon. The training area was empty now, Class 348 officially disbanded, remaining candidates reassigned to future rotations after psychological evaluation and security rescreening. The sand looked the same as it always did, dark and wet and littered with kelp and foam. No indication that a man had died here, that an enemy had walked among warriors and succeeded in his mission before anyone knew there was a mission to stop. Voller thought about Hale's last minutes. 92 minutes in freezing water, muscles seizing, breathing becoming impossible, conscious mind trapped in a body that was shutting down while instructors shouted encouragement and brothers in arms stood beside him not knowing he was dying until it was too late to save him. Hale had never quit, had never rung the bell that would have ended his hell week and possibly saved his life, had never asked for mercy or relief or extraction. He had stayed in the fight until his body gave out, and even then he had tried to walk ashore under his own power before collapsing face first into the surf. That was the kind of man Naval Special Warfare was designed to find. And that was exactly why the enemy had killed him. By December, new security protocols had been implemented across every special operations training facility in the Department of Defense. Biometric monitoring, enhanced background investigations, mandatory counterintelligence briefings, random toxicology screening for all personnel regardless of rank or clearance. The changes cost $14 million in the first year and prevented 3 additional assassination attempts before they reached execution phase. Petrov received a life sentence after a closed military tribunal where evidence was presented under seal and verdicts were delivered without public record. His foster parents received 23 years each in federal supermax facilities where they would spend the rest of their lives in administrative segregation. The details of Hale's death remained classified, officially recorded as training accident. Family notification limited to the information that their son had died serving his country with honor. Voller attended the funeral in Ohio on a Wednesday afternoon in November, standing in dress blues among mourners who knew Hale as a neighbor, a friend, a son who had wanted to serve and had paid the ultimate price for that desire. The service was small, held in a church that smelled like old wood and candle wax, eulogies delivered by a high school wrestling coach and a Marine Corps recruiter, who had helped Hale navigate the path from civilian to candidate. After the ceremony, Voller approached the family, introduced himself as Marcus's senior instructor, told them their son had demonstrated exceptional courage, exceptional discipline, exceptional commitment to his brothers, and that his death had not been in vain. He couldn't tell them about the investigation, couldn't explain the intelligence operation or the enemy penetration or the security failures that had allowed a hostile agent to walk onto a U.S. military installation and commit murder. But he could tell them the truth that mattered most. Their son had been a warrior, and warriors don't die from quitting. Hale's mother asked one question, her voice quiet but steady in the way of someone who had already cried all the tears she had and was now looking for something solid to hold on to. "Did my son quit?" Voller met her eyes and answered with the certainty of someone who had been there in the final moments, who had seen the body positioning and understood what it meant, who knew that Hale had stayed in formation until his body betrayed him. "No, ma'am. He never quit. He was still fighting when his body gave out. That's the mark of a warrior." The mother nodded, accepted the words, held them close as the only comfort she would ever receive. The funeral ended. People left. Life continued in the small Ohio town, where everyone knew everyone, and serving the country was a family tradition going back 4 generations. And somewhere in Coronado, California, Hell Week resumed with a new class, new faces, the same cold water and brutal evolutions designed to find the men who would carry the trident into the darkest corners of the world, where the enemy thought they were safe. Voller returned to his post, resumed training, watched new candidates struggle through the same surf torture that had killed Hale, and this time he watched differently, not just for physical limits and psychological breaking points, but for the subtle signs that someone didn't belong, didn't fit, wasn't there for the right reasons. The enemy had proven they could penetrate the most selective military training in the world. That meant the instructors had to be better, more vigilant, more willing to question everything and trust no one until trust was earned through action rather than words. It meant the war didn't end at the surf zone. It meant the fight was everywhere, always, even in places that were supposed to be safe. Marcus Hale's name would never appear on a memorial, would never be spoken in official ceremony, would never be remembered by anyone except the handful of people who knew what really happened and understood what his death prevented. But his legacy was written in new protocols, tighter security, heightened awareness that saved lives in ways no one would ever count, because the attacks that didn't happen don't make the news. That was enough. Sometimes the greatest victories are the battles that never occur because someone stood watch and refused to let the enemy through. Sometimes dying in training is the most important thing a warrior can do. Hale had earned his place among the warriors even if he never got to wear the trident, and Voller would make sure that every candidate who came after understood that the enemy was real, the threat was constant, and the price of freedom was paid in blood on beaches where the nation never knew a war was being fought.